Good afternoon for all those of you that are visiting us from outside of UVA. I am Felipe Correa. I'm the chair of the Department of Architecture. And this afternoon, I am delighted that Edmund Fowles is joining us today from London. Ed is co-founder alongside Fergus Feilden of Feilden Fowles, an architecture studio that with just over 10 years of practice has established itself as one of the leading and most innovative architecture offices in the United Kingdom. When looking at the work of Feilden Fowles, three extremely important qualities come to mind. The first one is a focus on the constructive detail as a driver of a larger spatial strategy. Drawing from vernacular and canonical examples, the work envisions the architectural detail as a material fragment that encodes a larger physical and cultural landscape. Two, an architecture that works hand in hand with institutions to improve their mission and the environments in which their everyday life unfolds. This is clear to me in their educational and cultural projects, for example, in the plan of the Applied Learning Center for the Ralph Allen School. And three, a very careful understanding of how design participates in the construction of new social and cultural identities. This has led to a practice that is prolific at integrating community engagement, critical conservation, and design innovation. Their list of awards and accolades is extensive, including being shortlisted for the RIBA 2019 James Stirling Prize, and a handful of RIBA Building of the Years awards, among many others. The spirit of Feilden Fowles has many affinities with the architectural values that are present here at UVA's Department of Architecture. Chief among them, the notion that thoughtful design can change the world in meaningful ways. Ed, welcome to UVA. We're very happy that you're here.
Thank you, Philippe. It's a pleasure. I'll just bring up my slides. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yep, all good.
Great, well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's the first time I've lectured in the States, albeit remotely, so a slightly unusual format. But today I wanted to talk to you about a topic I've not lectured on before, or neither framed our work through this lens, but it's a conversation we've been having on and off for many years within the practice, and that's about low-tech architecture. The practice was founded, as Philippe said, by myself and Fergus Feilden back in 2009, 2010. And we actually started here, which is a big dirty hole in South Wales, which is where our first project was built. And this was a project for a sustainable longhouse in the Welsh Mountains. And I suppose this really kind of ignited our interest, this project, in an awareness of the impact of what we do as architects. I think it's always surprising for architects when you commit a drawing to paper and then suddenly there's a big hole in the ground, there's machinery everywhere, and there's a building going up on site. But through this process of making this building, which we were doing during our RIBA Part 2, which is kind of our master's studies, it was an opportunity to really learn through the craft of making, and that's been kind of very central to our approach as a practice. So this was really kind of the Kickstarter for us being able to form a practice. We got this building published. We managed to win a few other small domestic projects, and that was all happening. This is a practice timeline of from 2009 all the way through to today, showing this very long tail of the kind of early days of the practice, with a handful, a clutch of projects, which gradually grew, as did the number of people with us, by about 2 people a year through to our present size of 20 architects. There they are there in our garden at the studio. But as is often the case with young practices, we spent our first 5 years or so really kind of dabbling away with small residential projects, domestic refurbishments. I'm sure projects which many of you are probably familiar with if you've worked in small offices. And these were actually really important projects for our practice to really learn the craft of making buildings, understanding materials. But today I really want to focus on low tech, which is a kind of theme which has begun to kind of run through many of our recent projects. So what do I mean by low tech? This man has been doing a lot of work recently, kind of making us aware of this rapid decline of biodiversity. So David Attenborough, A Life on Our Planet, I think there's a documentary which has just been released as well. In the UK alone, 1 in 7 species are threatened of biodiversity. And we all have a role to play as architects. So in the kind of world of ecology and conservation, there's a lot of talk about rewilding. I'm sure they're familiar. There are probably similar schemes in the US as well. This is an example from Net Farm in Sussex, where essentially kind of farmland, which is a kind of monoculture, has very little biodiversity, is left to its own devices and nurtured and encouraged back to its former kind of woodland. And I suppose as a practice, we've been kind of discussing this as a kind of, the context we find ourselves in. We need to kind of have greater awareness of our impact. Making buildings has a colossal carbon footprint. So what might a rewilding of architecture look like? What might kind of architecture which is a bit more embedded, which begins with the land and with the site and with the kind of available resources look like? And sort of importantly, as buildings have become more and more energy efficient, the operational energy becomes a much smaller proportion of the embodied carbon of making those buildings. Now, embodied carbon can be all sorts of things, from extracting the raw materials through to the manufacturing of them, transport, and so on. And obviously, there's a lot of embodied energy involved through the life of a building, as well as the kind of operational energy. So these are sort of the kind of underpinning conversations that led us to one of our recent projects and the making of our home in Waterloo, which sort of challenges this idea of, how long should a building last? Should it be reused if it's not going to last very long? Or should we be building much more permanent buildings, which are, say, supposed to last 200 years, 400 years? And how might we make architecture like that? So low tech, by low tech, I don't mean that we're sort of anti-technology. Technology has a massive role to play in making buildings smarter. And it's kind of ironic that Philippe used the word innovative in his description of our practice, because I think to look at many of our buildings, they don't immediately call out, and certainly as a member of the general public, you'd think that many of our works are perhaps buildings from a time past, and we draw lots of our influence from old buildings and from old techniques, because often those were there are many kind of techniques and processes and materials which have been lost to architecture today. So some of these approaches are summarized here, fabric first approaches. So really kind of starting with the physicality of the building itself, and trying to make that work as hard as possible in order to reduce the amount of bolt-ons of sort of technology that you have to throw at a building to make it energy efficient. So I'm going to touch on, I'm going to go through about 4 projects, time allowing, and talk to you about how we've been kind of experimenting with this approach to making buildings over the past 5 years or so. And that starts really at home. And I think there's no better place to demonstrate your values than where you base yourselves as a practice. And this was kind of a slightly unusual and fortuitous story about the way that our home here in Waterloo, we're just over the river from Westminster. So this is Parliament, just here, the Thames, St Thomas's Hospital. And there was this very abandoned piece of land which was given to a local school for use for 5 years for educational benefit. So really central. This is Westminster Abbey here. But despite being very central, because we're just south of the river, it's actually a very deprived part of South London. And there's an awful lot of poverty, and children in particular kind of living in poverty. These charities that were kind of offered the land are based, one nearby who runs local schools, and the land was sort of given for the use of getting kids outdoors, getting them to kind of learn from kinesthetic learning, planting, and all sorts of kind of agricultural lessons that could be kind of brought to this site. So it felt like kind of a perfect test bed for some of these ideas about a kind of a light touch approach to making buildings, a temporary type of architecture, which with a bit of forethought could be picked up and moved, dismantled later on. There was actually a history of temporary buildings on the site historically. So it was a nice sort of starting point to say we're going to be putting back some light touch buildings, but thematically kind of thinking about all sorts of opportunities through the theme of food, whether that be food production, cooking, and nutrition, kids learning about all those things. So we began developing this master plan for the site. And I should say that there was an interesting kind of economic strategy behind this site. So as we became more involved, we realized that the charities didn't really have enough money to pay us fees to deliver the whole project. So we suggested that we could become more involved in the project, design everything, get planning, and help them deliver it, help them fundraise, in return for us building our own studio at the end of the site. And at the time, we didn't have 2 pennies to rub together as business, but we looked at the economic model and said, well, if we can build a studio here for 5 years, if you compare that to the rent that we'd be paying elsewhere in the city, the rents are huge around here, then a building of modest scale for say 150, 160,000 pounds would actually be the equivalent of our rent for just 3 years in a similar setting. So we kind of did the sums and managed to borrow some money in order to make our studio, and therefore contribute all of our time to the farm and the charities for free to make the site happen. So we were quite inspired by really rubbish kind of farmers carpentry, bush carpentry, like just the way that things could be put together by very low skilled labor, therefore cheap labor on the site to make the initial kind of farm buildings. So lap jointed, using very regular section sizes of timber. And the first phase was delivered within the first year, which allowed the kids to get on site and start kind of getting stuck in with these pigs in here in the animal pens, there's sheep and goats, there's grow boxes. So that was this whole central section of the site here that we began with first. And then we moved on to developing the studio site, which would also be shared with the staff and the team who run the farm in terms of shared workspace, shared provision of toilets and meeting space and so on. And again, we kind of use this theme of kind of, very low tech, simple means of construction, borrowing from kind of agricultural precedents. And we like this idea that the building might have quite a blank, enigmatic presence onto the street, through which you came through a garden gate into this lovely kind of wilderness of a garden. And the positioning of the building was key to that. We were also very keen on kind of the tradition of artist studios, bringing in ample north light from these lovely kind of high windows. This is the Royal Academy of Art, their drawing and painting studio in London. So with this in mind, in terms of sort of starting with the fabric of the building as the first principle, we moved it all the way north up to the road's edge to form a boundary building. And then that formed this really generous south-facing courtyard garden. We made a very kind of heavily insulated shell to the building, but south-facing with overhanging eaves that should allow lots of winter sun in to heat the building in winter. And there was lots of experimentation with the roof form and how to kind of span the distance in the most economical way without having too much thrust on the perimeter walls. So the kind of technical and the kind of economic challenges of building as cheaply as possible were really driving the form of the building and making the form kind of shift. And this was kind of an early kind of concept of that long oversailing cantilever forming a kind of covered walkway, so circulation outside to reduce the internal footprint as well. And using kind of paired timbers as a kind of simple way of clutching onto the steel structure we needed to frame out the glass. We worked very closely with the kind of the standard sheet dimensions, so using the kind of standard 4x8 sheet to use for sheathing, and then all the components being easily dismountable, which was driven really by the connections being all pin jointed with stainless steel pins. And this was all sort of tested in the workshop just to kind of see how sort of easy they were to kind of take out. And then as well as the kind of construction of the building, we were thinking very carefully about the heating and ventilation and so on. And this detail kind of emerged. It was a lot cheaper to actually have a fixed casement window on the north of the building to let the light in, rather than an expensive kind of openable window with hinges and so on. And instead just have a very simple hinged piece of timber down here, which allows airflow above the height of people in the studio, about 3 meters height. So getting a really good cross ventilation through the space. We used very kind of simple agricultural, this is a material called onduline, which is recycled fibers bound together in bitumen. And we worked with a couple of local well, craftsmen. Alex actually worked for us as an architect and became a timber framer later down in his workshop in Devon. Lots of kind of prototyping down there, but using very simple techniques, making jigs. The building was very repetitive, so that made it very economical as well. All the joints were cut simply by hand. The joists were housed because it made it easy for them to be taken out at the end of the building's life. And whilst all that was going on, the slab was poured. And I think this was a great opportunity for the whole studio really to learn from the process of building. We're a relatively young studio. I think most of the studio are still kind of under 30. And so this was a really great opportunity for lots of the team to kind of see a live building project on site, almost day by day, as it went up. So I'll just flick through some of the construction shots. This was the frame going up, which went up in about a week. And then it was quite kind of nice to see sort of a timber frame going up with this backdrop of larger 60s and 70s buildings at the hospital. And the resulting studio, I think it's been so transformational for our practice, not least because of the amount of sort of extra space and this sort of connection to outdoors, having a garden space that we can spill out into. We can make models outside. This is a kind of before and after image showing the transformation and the kind of landscaped courtyard. And this just shows the building in use. And so this was sort of the second phase, the last phase being the barn at the other end of the site. And this was really crucial for the economic sustainability of the whole site. So this was a sort of social community space which would allow bigger kind of class groups to congregate from the schools, but also out of hours, evenings and weekends, it could be let out to generate a revenue. So using very similar principles to the other buildings on the site, very kind of simplistic joints. And this was sort of the farm in activity. So these are some of the kind of rental activities that go on to generate a bit of revenue for the charities and sustain the whole site. This is an uninsulated building, but perfect for kind of summer events in particular. And then at the other end, there's the more kind of tranquil, secluded garden. And, it sort of changed the culture of our practice because we have this place that we can, sit outside, that we can, if we're having a tough day of meetings, we can garden outside, but also the garden room here, which is a model making space. And I think importantly, it's been an opportunity to bring lots of our clients through the office and demonstrate our values in built form. Perhaps rather than sending them a brochure, we say, well, come and visit us on the farm and see the studio. So I suppose at a relatively small scale, it was quite easy to apply some of these sort of principles and experiment with these principles of simple construction, very lean construction, demountable construction. But it's a lot easier when you're doing that for yourself, but a bit harder when you're trying to apply that to a more public project. So the next project I want to talk about is a gallery we did for the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. And this is a remarkable place in Yorkshire. It's home to a very large collection of Henry Moore works, and he was one of the early patrons of the foundation. And the client approached us to think about their estate and try and expand the facilities across the estate by positioning a new building. So the original visitor centre was up here to the north. This area of the park was, the north part of the park was really heavily peopled, but the rest of the park less so, because there were no kind of facilities for parking or for getting a drink and refreshments and toilets and so on. And they wanted more sort of gallery space as well. So this location was strategically kind of agreed upon. And we began to kind of really immerse in the work of the park, both the more traditional sculptures in the round, but also works by James Tyrrell. There's a fantastic piece which is situated within this deer lodge. And for us, this was a really beautiful kind of knitting of existing fabric with this new intervention, which is sort of dropped in, offering this wonderful, very contemplative lighting qualities, but also more subtle work, such as David Nash in this work, where he kind of positions these charred timbers as a row of steps. The site itself was a depression in the land. It was formerly used for quarrying stone to build the stately home and many of the existing buildings across the estate. So it was very much a boundary building right on the edge of a road, a motorway, but then bounding the edge of this wonderful park with views down to the lake. So we had in mind these sort of the work of land artists, and this idea that we didn't want to just conceive and design a building and plonk it down on the land. We wanted to really kind of work with the topography. It was such a dramatic topography, kind of giving away down to the lake. And there are some wonderful works by the likes of Michael Heiser, the minimalists of the 60s and 70s, who kind of began in the galleries and then wanted to kind of break the boundaries and start working in much bigger scales outdoors. Robert Morris, and taking these sort of approaches to kind of moving the land and working with the landscape to kind of form space, as opposed to the sort of traditional idea of constructing space. So that was a kind of initial thinking behind it, kind of really enveloping the building in its context. And that worked quite well actually for environmental considerations of the building. So thinking about the conditions that one needs for a gallery space in terms of very constant temperature, very constant humidity and lighting levels, that works very well for kind of positioning it embedding it into a hillside. Whereas the more kind of public elements of the building, we had to form a kind of restaurant and cafe, shop and so on. These were positioned as more of a kind of lightweight pavilion, which became kind of moved out of the ground. So conceptually, we wanted to really reinforce this idea of the boundary to the site with this single cut through the building, which was the sort of gateway into the park. And that was reinforced by this idea to use aggregates that we were excavating from the site in order to make what originated as being kind of rammed earth, but later, for stability reasons, we had to add a bit of cement in there, but ostensibly a kind of very weak concrete mix. So this sort of shows the kind of three sort of tectonic elements, I suppose, these sort of rammed concrete walls, the gallery sort of dropping in very heavyweight construction to moderate the humidity, and then the lighter weight timber frame. We kind of searched lots of the local quarries as well for aggregates to use, as well as some sourced from site. And we were keen to kind of match the tones as closely as possible to the rock that we were pulling out of the ground, which had this very red iron oxide-y tone. And sort of drawings developed and refined this language of a quite striated, almost sedimentary rock form. All the material was sort of batched and mixed on site, pulled into the formwork. And you can see the sort of very dry mix, very kind of open kind of porous form of the walls. And they've changed throughout the whole project as the kind of aggregate was varied. But this sort of rock down here is a good example of the tones that were present on the site and how it kind of tied through. So in terms of moderating the humidity, this was a conversation that emerged with one of the M&E engineers about using the potential to use clay, essentially, or kind of unfired clay bricks to moderate the humidity rather than pulling air out of the gallery and passing it through a big piece of HVAC machinery and using lots of energy in the process. We pioneered this approach to draw air through a labyrinth of 10,000 unfired clay bricks. So these are the clay bricks in the void here. And this void was created by the kind of gap between the retaining structure and the internal gallery walls. And it's become very effective. We've been monitoring it for the last 2 years since the building opened. And the air is just, the only kind of mechanical assistance it needs is a fan just to draw the air through when there's sort of high or low humidity. And the clay is hygroscopic, so it draws in the moisture when it's very humid and lets it out when it's not so humid. So this is the kind of resulting building. So there are lots of kind of overlap, I suppose, with the learning that we made on building our own studio here in Waterloo in terms of the timber frame. So it is really a sort of building of two halves at both kind of this lightweight pavilion, which is sort of perched on the edge of the hill, but at once also embedded into the hillside. So at its deepest, the land really kind of obscures the height of the gallery. So we've got about a 5 meter floor to ceiling in there, but it just crests the horizon of the hillside here. And then the kind of wild grasses, sort of acid moorland, local grassland is able to kind of grow up and over the roof of the building. And these large concrete beams were kind of working quite hard in themselves as well, forming kind of roof lights, but also valleys to the roof and dropping in this very nice diffuse light. And then moving through to the restaurant space. And there were other kind of material decisions, such as using lime plasters, kind of natural plasters, which has this sort of very distinct patina. It's very imperfect, which felt consistent with the exterior walls. So this was a building that was shortlisted for the Sterling Prize last year, which was much to our surprise. But it has been a really good opportunity. It was our first truly kind of public building. So as an opportunity to kind of demonstrate some of these more kind of grounded, sort of earthy approaches to the materials. It was a good process. And we through the making of the building, we were kind of making a book as well. So this is now available on our website if you're more interested in learning more about this project. But I want to just touch on two further projects and sort of scaling up again in terms of this project, because as I touched on with the studio, it's relatively easy to be lean and make certain decisions on your own project. But as the projects get bigger, they demand more services. And this project, which is a dining hall, naturally needs sort of professional kitchens for cooking. How do you make a building like that as sustainable as possible, and how do you make it lean, and how do you contextualize it as well? So there's always these competing things, and it's sort of difficult to take one on too strongly without the others impacting that. So this is a project for one of the Cambridge colleges, Homerton College. It's one of the newest Cambridge college. It was actually a teacher's training college for many years, and it was only in 2010 that it became a Cambridge College. It's the largest of all of them. And it began its life as this is sort of a historic picture of the site with the kind of great hall at the centre here, which is where the current dining hall is. Kind of Victorian Gothic style. It's situated slightly outside of the city centre, so the sort of heart of Cambridge is here, and then we're down to the south here. So it's unique in that it has this very kind of open setting compared to the very dense collegiate setting of central Cambridge. And the site sits next to this very handsome arts and crafts building, which was a really important starting point for the project, really kind of getting to know the Ibbotson building, which sat right next to our site, which is here. And we kind of began talking about the project in terms of a kind of an arts and crafts for the 21st century. And I think this sort of low-tech, more kind of aware approach to making buildings and an awareness of kind of the sourcing of materials and so on is so akin to what the arts and crafts movement were calling for. They were calling for the hand of the craftsman to be more visible in the building. So broadly speaking, the brief was for a new dining hall, a new formal dining hall, so seating 300 students, but inevitably with a big kitchen which served not just this hall, but also the wider college as well. So in amongst that, though, we wanted to kind of pull the brief apart a bit and sort of look at the more social aspects and the importance of food as a kind of an activator or a kind of opportunity for chance encounters around a kind of collegiate environment. So not really focusing just on the design or the kind of intensity being on the whole, but on these sort of fragments of space or kind of in between spaces around the building. So we actually kind of grew the brief somewhat from the original competition brief. We were very interested, I think, through the competition process with architects like Van der Laan and his sort of monastic work, building kind of very simple, robust structures in sort of the Flemish regions. And we were kind of working off many of the kind of existing rhythms established by the Ibbotson building with this lovely rhythm of brick columns. But with this idea to place these two volumes, so have a plinth, which was very kind of expressed at the base, and then the hall to be articulated, and the kind of buttery and kind of gathering space, the foyer space, to be accentuated with another volume, sort of slightly offset, and each to have a slightly distinct material character. There was a lot of interest as well in the quality of life for the people who work in the building, not just the students, but what about the chefs who have to work there, who presently are in the depths of a kind of Victorian building with no daylight, no views to outside. So this image was really important as a kind of a thing to hold on to through the project process, hanging on to getting daylight into the kitchens and having a kitchen with a view. So when you're doing your prep, you can look out the window and you're not in the basement. So this is how the brief then kind of coalesced with, kitchen, dining hall, this servery sitting between the two. So obviously lots of very critical kind of flows involved in designing food spaces. But with the sort of foyer here and the kind of main college entrance. And the resulting plan, somewhat more worked up, looked something like this. So very strong axis coming from the college, from the existing college facilities, accommodation, the bar, down to this generous entrance lobby here. And then this double height sort of gathering space, which out of hours could be used for more informal, picking up a sandwich or a cup of coffee, the servery, and then this very hardworking spine, sort of separating the building, but also acting very importantly for some of our servicing. And then moving up to the first floor, the sort of balcony space, which overlooks the hall. So sectionally, the building, it slightly inverts the the typical Oxbridge dining hall, which tend to be very hermetic. They're very enclosed at ground floor level particularly. We wanted to really open up the base of the building with windows out to this small area of woodland, but then also drop in a lot of daylight from clerestory windows, which could mediate passive ventilation as well, with openable windows at high level. So drawing air in at low level and out at high level. We also utilised ground source heat pumps to bring a kind of passive, relatively passive form of heating to the building. And then there's a small degree, when you've got 300 people in this hall, we have this ability to draw the air out of the hall and then exchange it with heat coming out of the kitchen and put it back into the hall. So there were these sort of ideas about kind of the circulation of heat in the building. So going back to some of the more kind of material qualities, these were some of the features of the surrounding buildings, and particularly the Ibbison building, the Arts and Crafts building. This beautiful array of kind of tile and ceramics. And so the principles of this very hard-working kind of plinth, which was sort of mediating all of the kind of functions of the building, was sort of established, that having this sort of outdoor cloister and a kind of indoor cloister with the servery kind of expanded perimeter to the main hall. But each of the main primary kind of public spaces would be framed with a timber frame which was supporting the roofs. And this was kind of the emerging tectonics of the building. So the plinth, as I described, and then these two timber frame structures. And throughout this process, we've been kind of working with Max Fordham, M&E engineer, to kind of understand the embodied energy of all the materials. And actually, after we started the project, the RIBA, our governing body, brought in some really radical targets and graded targets. So bringing in targets for 2020, 25 and 2030 in terms of embodied carbon. And although we were 5 years into the project already by 2020, we're aiming to kind of exceed that and bring it in at under 650 kilograms of carbon per meter squared for embodied energy. So the material, we've been drawing a lot from the sort of arts and crafts and the Gothic of the Great Hall, and we wanted to kind of give a real depth to this elevation, which would partly serve for shading to those great big clerestory windows. And this material of faience, sort of ceramic material, is quite common on kind of pub frontages and tube stations and so on. And tiles, obviously, kind of widely used within kind of the arts and crafts movement. So we began to kind of work with this supplier, this fabricator, Darwin Terracotta, who produced these extraordinary glazes, which really kind of resonate with the copper oxide on many of the roofs at the college. This sort of blue tint, which is given through the glazing process, and that paired with the more kind of earthy tones of the plinth of the building, which would be a kind of low cement concrete for the plinth. And we experimented a lot through model making. So testing the interior qualities in 1 to 50 scale and 1 to 20, following up with design reviews and iteration, and really kind of, playing on some of the themes, some of the qualities of the traditional halls in terms of their kind of very formal, solid paneling at the ground floor level, but really opening up the base of the building. So this is the resulting, this is the 1 to 50 model we made. And structurally, this timber frame, we wanted to really articulate internally and express these sort of joints and really kind of allow those to kind of tell the story of how the joints are put together. So they're all just doweled joints. So they slot in and they have these pegged, doweled and pegged joints at the eaves and at the center where the butterfly crosses. This was something that was tested again at a slightly larger scale in terms of the angles of roof, where it kind of met the perimeter of the building, how that tied through with linings, and followed that through to the other public spaces in the building. And this was the approach from the college side, showing the faience cladding to the top there. And I think despite relatively heavyweight materials being used, and obviously faience and ceramic has an embodied footprint, you know, it has to be fired at 1,000 odd degrees. It's still much less than concrete, full fat concrete, as it were. And the brief from the client for this building was for an incredibly robust building, you know, which would be there for at least 200 years. So this sort of idea of a very lightweight building, you know, we had to make a choice about very robust materials on the perimeter, on the envelope of the building. So this is recently begun on site. So this is some of the guys on site making this plinth, crafting some of the formwork to form some of the curved concrete columns at ground floor level. And these are all dyed with this natural kind of iron oxide pigment. And some of the early tests that we've been doing with the ceramic glaze. And we're hoping to complete this project in about a year's time. It's still a fair way to go on site. So just briefly to touch on, I'm going to end with this project, which is a project for the Natural History Museum in central London, in South Kensington. And this is really kind of epitomizes many of the themes the practice has been touching on. It's very directly related to the farm and studio site here in terms of creating kind of a learning environment with kind of buildings and gardens, very kind of interconnected. Many of you may have visited the Natural History Museum if you've been to London. It's a very popular tourist destination, an extraordinary collection of natural history. But the gardens aren't quite fitting for the magnitude of the collection that exists within the museum. And the Natural History Museum has launched this wonderful project, the Urban Nature Project, which is in part to improve and sort of tell the story of past nature and future nature within their gardens, kind of taking, I suppose, sort of lots of the knowledge and exhibits that are held within the building and putting them outside the building as a showcase. And this is really to kind of engage young people in particular in the excitement of botany, of biodiversity, and really kind of alert them to the challenges that we're faced with at the moment. And it's important to educate in order to do that. So this project is very much a kind of multidisciplinary project. We're the lead designer on it, but we're working very closely with J&L Gibbons, who are the leading kind of landscape designers. And the scope is to redesign the whole of the museum's gardens, and to tell this story all the way from deep time in the kind of Cambrian, pre-Cambrian era, all the way through to the present day here at the central entrance, and then have a representation of all of the current kind of habitats we find within the UK and British Isles on the western side of the gardens, with a kind of showcase of potential ideas for kind of future nature and how we might kind of green our cities and kind of think about kind of urban nature in the future. So this is a sort of summary. It is very much a work in progress. It's recently gone into planning, but from the east of the gardens here, we'll be moving through a series of kind of gardens with geology and planting representative of that era. So we move from the Cambrian through all of the kind of the geological eras, the Jurassic, for example, with dinosaurs came to emergence, through the extinctions to what's currently being called the Anthropocene. And then, as I said, on the west here, we have kind of a representation of wildlife in the UK. So we've been learning a lot about geology in particular. We've got to represent all of these different strata, and this is coming through in the way that we're forming a new ramped kind of entrance from the tube tunnel into the site. And I'd just like to take you through a few visuals to give you a sense of what the gardens will feel like. So as you emerge here, you're moving through some of the earliest rock, which is Lewisian gneiss, about 200 million years old. And as you emerge up to this part of the gardens, we're in the Carboniferous forests, just before the dinosaurs emerging. So tree ferns and cycads and mosses growing up. So the intention is that the experience is incredibly immersive, and within this, this landscape will be all sorts of artifacts, whether they be small animals or fossils, footprints and tracks located within the gardens and interpreted. But of course there are some buildings involved as well. There's a small cafe facility here and restaurant which secures the museum's long-term economic sustainability, important for them to make an income from the gardens. But this is very much echoing the language of this geological timeline wall. So the strata of rock used in this building are consistent with the geological eras that we're representing opposite the building. And this is something that Sir Alfred Waterhouse, who designed the original great museum building, I think was playing on when he used this sort of these banding of the elevation. Here he's using kind of terracotta tiles, but there's this grey banding which is very kind of, I think, deliberate and distinctive of kind of bedded stone. So this building will actually be a kind of botanic display space as well. So in the winter, lots of the plants that can't weather the London British winter will have to be brought inside to this south-facing glazed space. And then this in turn is used as a thermal buffer and a kind of a solar game which can then feed the cafe space. It's the main volume, again, all work in progress at the moment. And as you move through to the West Gardens, there's an expansion of the existing wildlife gardens around to the south of the museum, with chalk grasslands and acid moorlands and woodlands. There's about 15, 20 different habitat types represented within this area. And we're creating this sort of sunken walkway through the ponds, which will allow children to engage more and do experiments, pond dip, and really kind of get involved in science and exploration within the gardens. And then a new learning and activity centre based in the gardens, which serves both for the maintenance of the whole gardens, but really bringing that to the fore and allowing the public to see how the gardens are upkept, what sort of activities go on in terms of cutting back, collecting leaves, composting, but also it's a kind of lens into the amazing science that goes on. There's about 300 scientists based at the Natural History Museum, and many of which are doing experiments within the gardens themselves. It's so important and vital that we learn more about our kind of urban nature and about species that are being lost so rapidly, and this urgent need to kind of green our cities. So this is just briefly touching on the kind of relationship between those two buildings and that geological strataing of the plinth to the two buildings. Again, bringing in lots of the learning as a practice that we've had from our studio building here and later from the Weston in Yorkshire. And some of these sort of in-between spaces, which, you know, a lot of the activities are intended to happen outdoors. So the kind of outdoor of the building is very activated with places to wash hands, places to store gardening equipment, as well as a more conventional kind of classroom space, but that's connected into the landscape. And we're very fortunate that Sir David Attenborough is a patron of the museum, of the Natural History Museum, and there's an important quote that he's that's being embedded within the gardens, which is this, which I think really sums up the importance of the mission of this project, really, but also the importance of how we must all think about the way that we're acting in terms of the buildings we're making, what great impact we have and what great positive impact we can have if we begin to make buildings in a more considered, light touch and possibly low tech way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed, for what was an absolutely fantastic lecture. I think it was sort of extremely impressive, both sort of in terms of the body of work, but I think all the pedagogical sort of lessons that I think the work embodies for our students. And we're going to open it up to questions shortly. So I would ask people in the audience to either type the questions in the chat or to raise your hand, your Zoom hand, and I'll sort of follow the order of the questions. But before we go into sort of questions from the public, as sort of the public begins to prepare their questions, I would start with one specific sort of comment slash question, which goes back to the issue of innovation. And I think sort of for me, one of the sort of greatest sort of challenges, but also one of the most satisfying moments in architecture, is in the ability to innovate, not through sort of radical moves, but through the gradual changing of habitual modes, right? The gradual changing of established habits. And in that way, your work has a certain anthropological quality, right? In that it's both transforming landscapes, but it also becomes a new mirror for those landscapes. It also encodes a larger sort of geography through the act of architecture. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit specifically as to this condition. How, of course, it's very, the lineage is very clearly presented in the lecture, but there also seems to be a series of nested scales, right? One building builds to the other, and in that way, there's like a treasure chest of cultural conditions that I find fascinating. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's very hard to act kind of without the sort of baggage of what you've done before you. And that might be positive baggage or negative, and you know, it's obviously good to learn from your mistakes. But I think there's been this sort of growing interest and desire within the practice to actually always start our projects from a landscape master plan, or from a kind of an idea about the land, before necessarily kind of trying to tackle issues of program and plan. And I think our work is sort of very preoccupied with tectonics and with what it's made of, and kind of what that material is doing, and trying to make that material kind of work as hard as possible for us in terms of structure and expression and so on. But I think this idea of landscape, I think that probably is most true of our work at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, where we really wrestled with that sort of the topography and with the building, like putting a big build, for us, a big building in this beautiful listed landscape was quite a big deal. And I think that's perhaps why we kind of wanted to hunker down. It was kind of an emotional response as much as anything. Emotional in terms of our own kind of feelings and sensibilities when we visited the site and it was lashing with rain, and we wanted to sort of hunker down and sort of protect ourselves, but also a kind of, I suppose, perhaps a shyness to act more boldly, but perhaps that's sort of in our nature, in our character as designers, Fergus and I. But I think, yeah, that project really taught us that you could begin with an idea about landscape that kind of led to a kind of building approach, or an approach to building, which is very kind of, and I think you would have seen from the slides I showed, that there is this very enveloped and kind of knitted resulting building with this sort of landscape sort of folding over the top of the building. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's in a way that's sort of that very clearly states, I think, sort of the principles that were very sort of well sort of illustrated or visualized through the projects. I think with this we can open to questions from the public. Just feel free. Devin has raised his Zoom hand. Devin, where are you?
Yeah, I'm right here.
There you are. Yeah.
Well, thank you again. That was a really wonderful lecture, and I thought maybe I wanted to kind of tack on a little bit to Felipe's question, which, you know, I was struck also in your presentation by the role that the images that you showed played in conveying certain ideas about hybridity and about this notion of incremental change that I think is really powerful, because actually your work made me start to think in a very interesting way about how notions of sustainability may not necessarily need to mimic the kind of monolithic idea of architecture that was so present in many kind of modernist buildings, and even kind of those buildings from the 1960s that you see that look so solid and so hermetic and so complete. And I think what's really interesting about the projects is that they all have kind of levels of what you think of as durability and porosity and all these things. And I guess the question I have is, in terms of the images, you know, I guess I'm curious, you know, some of those images you make for yourselves to kind of convince, you know, their proof of concept for these ideas. And some of them are to kind of convince or convey the power of these potential ways of designing, like for instance, leaving so much exposed timber instead of kind of covering everything over and making it look kind of uniform. So I guess my question, it's a bit of a comment on that, but also a question for you and how these images actually function for your design process, and also how you kind of convince clients of the novelty of this approach.
I think it's a really important point, because we do invest a lot of time and energy and conversation about the way we represent our work. And after all, the product of the architect themselves is drawings and images. You know, we don't make the building. We author the instructions to make that building. And part of the authorship of that information is about selling an idea and selling a vision, or rather kind of conveying a client's vision back to them. I think, you know, many of our images do borrow from techniques of painting and are quite collaged and gather together lots of quite kind of painterly material, I suppose, to kind of soften the blow of development and the kind of impact. Obviously kind of having lots of greenery shrouding your building makes it feel kind of a lot more amenable to planners and statutory bodies who you need to get permissions from. But I think we've always really kind of enjoyed making images which are kind of a product in themselves, or the kind of a work of art even in themselves. And it's I suppose worth noting that some of the images for the Natural History Museum that we made, and that's by far the most public project we've ever worked on, sort of hundreds of people to present to through the process, whether they be planners or various levels of the management of the museum, and they have to be powerful, and they have to convey that message, and they have to attract funders. You know, they're doing so much, but in themselves, we want to produce images that in themselves can be conceived as, you know, a work in their own right. And 3 of the images are actually exhibited at the moment as part of the Royal Academy Summer Show, which I think is testament to the kind of, to that approach, actually kind of giving real weight to the image as a kind of product in itself.
Thanks, Devin and Ed. We have one question in the chat, which sort of is about timber. And the question by Timothy is, timber plays an important role in your designs. How do you go about selecting species?
Good question. Well, we've had a lot of experience using Douglas fir, and that's probably largely driven by its availability in the UK. We can source it from the north of England, from Scotland. And it's relatively durable. You can use it externally, and it's cheaper than oak, which and many other kind of hardwoods. So for us, it was kind of an obvious choice, given our kind of geographic location, to work with. It's also a relatively soft timber to work with in terms of cutting joints and things. And working very closely with a friend of the practice, Alex Thomas of Timber Workshop, who's built many of our timber frames for us. He's always sort of held our hand and kind of talked us through sort of species selection and so on. But as our building projects grow, on the Homerton project, for example, we've reached a kind of a logical maximum span. You know, our studio here is about 7 meters the span, which you can do in one piece of timber. Okay, but here we've had to pair them with some plywood down the center. But as you get to kind of 12, 15 meter spans, you need to go to obviously engineered timber, and we've been really kind of battling to try and find more local sources of glulam timber, which largely are only available in Europe. There's a lot of manufacturing goes on in Germany and Austria, but we were using sweet chestnut, and that was sort of mainly motivated by the availability in the southern counties of the UK. And sweet chestnut can be coppiced, so it's a coppiced crop, so very, very quickly regrows, and the small sections are ideal for making glulam. So decisions on timber are rarely based on the visual, the look of the timber. We don't line timbers up and say, oh, the oak looks nice, we'll go for that. It's very much about the properties of the timber and the availability and the sourcing.
Thank you, Ed. Any additional questions? Peter?
I guess I'm supposed to raise my hand, right?
That's fine.
You know, I just finished lecturing in what's called Architecture 101, which is a foundation class about an hour ago. And to hear your lecture now, which is such a pedagogic, as Felipe said, and foundational set of how does one obviously from the scale of the farm or to how to read the greening of the city, again, the urban landscape, to your word shyness, because as you approach a site, you take the time to feel it, to read it, etc., the preconditions of that which was there, and then not necessarily asserting an heroic object, but actually a frame is another phrase you use to read the place, literally frames, structural frames, etc., through there, and the very materialities that are resident from the site or the histories of site like that. It's such an extensive scalar approach, which has to do with the issue of lightness. And yes, there's luminosity in that light, which is extraordinary, but it's lightness of material that Italo Calvino, about in 1987, was published just after he died, 6 memos for the next millennium. And he said, after a millennium of heaviness and gigantic heavy institutional buildings and all that, of which you played with, maybe this new millennium, there were lectures delivered at Harvard. The last one, he died in an airplane going from London actually to Boston. But the resonance word light in all its manifestations has made this talk and your so-called humble buildings, but extraordinary new beginning, okay, at what might be called the vernacular craft or the art of Felipe said again, the detail, but it's also, they have a certain, is it innovative? No, I think it's primal. I would say not primitive, but a primal connection to the touch of the condition and the timeline. That's the last point I wanted to make, which is so instructive. You talk about the landscape from geologically, et cetera, through there, and you show that construction of the buildings from slab to frame, et cetera, over time. Most people come in and show the finished object. But what's so externally important now, as long as craftspeople build the buildings, is that they take time and they also weather. And I think that's the greatest lesson among many that you have offered. So it's a great foundation. It's like one of these, I'm not much into YouTubes, but it's a kind of a takeaway as maybe for young students, as well as those who are about to do their thesis, to remember the shyness that architecture can have to engage the world or connect. So anyway, it's not a question so much as appreciation of a scale that a young practice can actually be so profound. I hope one day you come and lecture here in person, if not to a studio, because I think the Jefferson projects, and I'm not talking about style, but what they took over the years and the materials that he built immediately from resonate. This immediately here is an example as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
We have a couple of sort of the chat has populated significantly since I last looked at it. So I'm actually going to go through maybe 2 or 3 questions at once that sort of, and then maybe the answer sort of can tie them together. Paul Weston says, can you talk some more about the interstitial spaces, particularly within cultural buildings, and how those spaces are important for the social aspects of the program? And then we have 2 questions that I think sort of are related. One is very straightforward. How do you convince the clients to build models? And the second is, as a young practice with such a strong focus on materiality, how do you anticipate or envision the aging of the materials you use without having lived to see them age yourself? Is the practice's fondness for archaic techniques partly a way to counter this?
Oh, great series of questions. So on the interstitial spaces, I think that concept for the Homerton College, the dining hall, I think I mentioned that, really was derived from lots of our education work. We've done 3 or 4 school buildings now, and spent a lot of time working in schools and talking to teachers and so on. And what's really interesting is that apparently most learning goes on outside the classroom. So, okay, kids go into class and they have some lectures, but actually when the actual learning happens and the connections are made, it's in smaller groups, it's in those informal conversations, it's down the pub or sitting having a coffee with your friends, discussing those themes and those ideas, that things start to kind of fall into place. And so in lots of our education buildings, we've been asked to design classrooms, but to make breakout space as well, you know, to send groups away in small clusters. And I think it's sort of an increasing theme of education buildings that we're seeing, kind of less conventional, 60-meter squared rooms with 30 chairs, looking at a screen, and actually more collaborative working, more interdependent kind of learning. And I suppose that was our kind of way in the Homerton College project of saying, and particularly in a collegiate environment like Cambridge, where you go to your department building, you have your lectures, but you come back to college, back to kind of the domestic environment and eat together. And it's saying that it's not just about the formal hall, but it's about the informal. So those around the buildings, we've created these niches all around the elevation of the hall, which have these very deep, the sort of 800 millimeters deep columns, where there are these niches for benches. So lots of moments to perch underneath a stair, in a window seat, on the edge of the building, which I think will be really kind of useful and purposeful for the students. On the models question, we often don't price for models. It sounds crazy. It's just part of the way we work. I can't imagine us doing a project without making a model. So it's only presentation models. If a client says, yeah, we want to get some funding, we charge them for that. But by that point, it's too late. Because by that point, you've got planning and it's not really a kind of a working model. And what we love is making models to learn from. So holding them together with tape, lots of our images were created by taking photographs of those models. And actually there's an economy in making a model which teaches you about the way the building's put together. And then if you can take a photograph and that will make a beautiful image, then you've saved probably 3 weeks doing a 3D model and photoshopping and so on. So I think there's a lot of economy and value in making physical models. And then on the aging and the patina of materials, I suppose we're very interested in making buildings and learning from buildings that are timeless and trying to make buildings that are timeless. So not really specifically of 2020, but just buildings that sit comfortably in their setting, which we know will age well. And how do we know they'll age well? Well, we look at old buildings and we look at the detailing of buildings. And we've been very fortunate to work recently with a cathedral in the north of England and make a new intervention, a new pavilion building connecting up the old Freightree building with the campus. And it's been fascinating on that project to learn all sorts of tricks of the trade from the stonemasons. And every cathedral has their own stonemason practically who lives there on site repairing bits of cathedral that fall off. And it's fascinating, just conversations with them about the positioning of a joint to avoid a drip, the way that certain stone is, every kind of crease and reveal has a kind of reason to be there, seemingly to kind of deal with the way that water runs off it. So there's so much, we don't need to learn, we don't need to invent anything new. Like there's so much knowledge in old buildings that is really exciting to us as architects today, and that we can learn from to make sure that the buildings we're making today still look terrific, hopefully in 100 years' time, if they're looked after.
Thanks, Ed. We have, I think, one last question here, and then I have one more question for you, a last question. This one is, you spoke of building prototypes of connections and materials in the workshop. Is this done in the office or typically with trade partners? How soon is this in the process? Do many in your studio also have craft, art, and building experiences? So basically the process of sort of scale size, real size mock-ups and so on.
Yeah, that's great. So we, when I described sort of moving on to this new studio and having the farm and the outdoor space, it was an absolute game changer because it meant that we had space to kind of to experiment with. So we built a workshop. So one of the last pens, as you can see it in the background, just that's our workshop. So that's our kind of messy workshop. That's got kind of woodworking tools and power tools and whatever. And yeah, we try and do quite a bit in-house. There's lots of keen carpenters in the office, architects who are kind of interested in woodworking particularly. But we also have other interests in the practice. So there's one lady working on the Homerton College project who is a potter as well and does ceramics. So it's probably not just a chance that we've ended up using ceramics on that project, but it's been really helpful to have someone who has a knowledge of glazes and knows about kind of firing process and knows about temperatures and shrinkage and all those things which you just wouldn't have a clue about unless you've actually worked with a piece of clay. So I think we're quite fortunate to have a very skilled, very kind of engaged bunch of people working in the practice who are alert to and kind of keen on getting their hands dirty. So some of the things we make here, so we obviously do all the models here, but we've made timber connections, timber joints. We've made, ceramic tests here, which then get fired elsewhere. We've done brick panels on site with bricklayers. So there's quite a lot of stuff going on usually. And then if there's anything we can't fabricate, like metal, we get that kind of outsourced. But it's quite nice to have lumps of building lying around the place, a bit of a kind of graveyard of things that maybe worked or didn't work. It's sort of always good to learn from.
Very good. Very good. Ed, maybe one last question. Of course, sort of today, the lecture, we had a very broad audience, but a large sort of percentage of the audience are students, right? Students that are looking at offices like yours, sort of for internships, sort of for future jobs. What would you advise? What do you look at when you're hiring people? If you were to sort of give us sort of the three key aspects that you look at in a profile when you want to bring somebody to the team, what would that be?
Mm-hmm. That's great. And I think the main things are, I mean, as a practice, we really believe in getting your hands dirty and building. And I think if people can have some experience of that, whether they've done a summer school, making a little shed somewhere for their uncle, I don't know, like any kind of practical building skills, I think kind of goes a long way to kind of impressing us. And as I've just described earlier, you know, lots of the team have sort of making skills. And I think until you get your hands dirty and you start working with materials, you know, it's very hard to really understand the properties of materials and design a building. So I think, yeah, practical skills are really important. I think also just understanding their wider interests and not being, you know, we look for interesting people to work with us who have broad and kind of similar kind of interests and similar values. So I think knowing that even if we don't necessarily like a kind of stylistic approach in someone's work, I think if the ideas and the values are right and their kind of heart's in the right place, then that's almost more important than the kind of resulting product. And it's something that kind of Fergus and I, my business partner, when we first met, our architectural kind of approaches and styles were kind of not quite chalk and cheese, but they're quite different and divergent. And but we actually came to know each other and got talking about bicycles and the outdoors and had these sort of other shared passions. And then the kind of tension, the kind of creative tension was always quite a healthy one. Yeah, so in terms of skills, I think showing your values and showing kind of practical skills and just broader interests, I think are all really important.
Very good. Well, Ed, once again, thank you so much for this. I didn't know that this was your inaugural lecture in US schools, but we feel very lucky that UVA had you first, even if it's only virtually. But of course, we hope that this relationship continues, that you can actually visit the UVA campus, that sort of we can visit your office when either I or faculty or students are in London. And of course, we'll continue this, this conversation and this friendship in the years to come.